Cimarrones, rebels, and plaintiffs. Strategies enslaved Africans and their descendants used to resist slavery in Puerto Rico, 16th to 19th centuries. By DANIEL MORALES-ARMSTRONG. Abstract. This article examines the history of African slavery and resistance to it in Puerto Rico from the 16th through 19th centuries. It places the actions of enslaved Africans who were trafficked to the colony and their descendants within the hemispheric context of acts of resistance to the institution, particularly during the period marked by the rise of Puerto Rico's sugar industry in the late 18th, early 19th century. The text examines the strategies used by Puerto Rico's enslaved population to combat the imposed condition of bondage from their arrival in the early 1500s through the end of slavery in 1873, how those strategies changed over time, and the effects of their efforts in the broader context of Puerto Rican slavery. Daniel Morales-Armstrong is a diasporican historian and educator. He received his PhD in History and Africana Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the emancipation process in Puerto Rico and how the colony's freed people responded to the post-abolition forced labor system. He has published on the subject in Slavery and Abolition, the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, and a Puerto Rican anthology for the 150th anniversary of abolition in Puerto Rico. He has taught classes about the African diaspora in Latin America at the University of Pennsylvania and Rutgers University, and has led travel courses on the African diaspora in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Peru. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the CUNY Hunter Center for Puerto Rican Studies. In July 1843, the Spanish Ministerio de Guerra, Ministry of War, published a notice in the Gaceta de Puerto Rico, the colony's state-run newspaper, about an, quote, uprising of black slaves, end quote, in Toa Baja earlier this year, resulting in, quote, 8 of the most criminal of the unnamed enslaved rebels having been put to death, end quote, by gunfire. 7 years later, another notice appeared in the Gaceta about a different group of enslaved people who had escaped from one of the colony's prisons. The escaped prisoners in this latter group, José Ramón, José Antonio, Alejandro, León Figueroa, Cupidón, Evaristo, Ana y María, had fled after they were sentenced, quote, for the violent murder of the plantation overseer D. Juan Solas, end quote. What do these two incidents, for which groups of enslaved people in Puerto Rico appear in the state newspaper for their criminalized behaviors, have in common? They demonstrate the varied methods that those held in bondage in the colony used to challenge and escape the circumstances of their lives under slavery, as well as the lengths to which they went to do so. In this regard, their actions challenged the popular narrative that enslaved people in Puerto Rico were docile, instead aligning them with those of other enslaved Africans and their descendants in the hemisphere who resisted the conditions imposed on them under slavery. Wherever the institution of slavery existed, so did resistance, and Puerto Rico was no exception. Slavery, sugar, and population demographics in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, like most plantation colonies in the hemisphere, built its riches off the theft of indigenous land and the enslavement of Africans and their descendants to work that land. Though Puerto Rico was a relatively small plantation society in comparison to Spain's other colonies in the Americas, its riches too were fueled by African slavery from the first decade of the 16th century. In response to the widespread killing of the local Taíno indigenous population through forced labor, the Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas proposed to the Spanish crown the elimination of Taíno enslavement, suggesting instead the use of African populations, because the Spanish perceived the Africans as, quote, kinless and totally mobile laborers. The first large-scale importation of 200 enslaved Africans to Puerto Rico occurred in 1518. The Spanish, like their counterparts in other European empires, used the plantation system as the engine for their imperial wealth building, and the millions of enslaved Africans, primarily from West and Central Africa, who were subjected to toil under the system as the human fuel upon which it ran. Enslaved people were kidnapped and brought to the Caribbean colony by traffickers from the various European empires to which asientos, vendor permits, were granted for the importation of enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies. To a lesser extent, already captured prisoners of war, a market driven largely by European demand for human captives, were purchased by Europeans in Africa prior to sailing for the Americas. Kidnapped Africans who were trafficked to Puerto Rico were forced into domestic service for individuals or made to labor in the larger-scale economies of gold mining, building urban infrastructure, and the harvest of sugar, coffee, and other crops for local consumption or export. Those in the domestic sphere were assigned to tasks such as cooking daily meals and cleaning residences or plantation grounds, tailoring, and child-rearing. These oficios, occupations, were more often assigned to women, children, and elderly enslaved people than men in their peak labor years, though not exclusively. Many enslaved people in urban centers such as San Juan, the colony's capital, were forced to labor in trades shaped by the needs of their residential environments and the kinds of people who held them in bondage. These included, but were not limited to, specialized work as tailors, washpersons, bricklayers, shoemakers, bakers, and gilders. David Stark notes, as early as 1534, colonial officials asserted that the population of highly skilled enslaved laborers was so essential to the city's functioning that those in the colonial settlement, quote, could not live without enslaved black people, unquote. Domestic tasks allowed a greater level of individual interaction with captors, which meant simultaneously more access to information overheard in conversation, and the possibility of clandestine literacy for those accompanying minors to school, as well as greater surveillance through which their actions in their daily lives could be scrutinized as punishable. Plantations in Puerto Rico were spaces of concentrated enslavement, where Afro-descendants toiled year-round to produce sugar, coffee, tobacco, and other tropical fruits for export. Throughout the more than 350 years of formal slavery on the island, the greatest of the colony's agricultural products were sugar, particularly among the plains of the island's coasts, which peaked in production in the 19th century, and coffee, grown primarily in the colony's central mountain range. Enslaved people in Puerto Rico were engaged in every level of the sugar and coffee industries, from constructing plantation buildings to harvesting the crops and preparing them for export. Across their estimated 45 years of most intense plantation laboring, between 15 to 55 years of age, the work of planting, weeding, tending, and harvesting the cane included tasks of, quote, chopping, carrying, and grinding the sugar cane, end quote, as well as, quote, processing the sugar amidst the infernal noise and heat of the boilers, end quote. Though they worked at times alongside free laborers on the plantations, enslaved Africans were assigned to, quote, all the industrial tasks, unquote, for which compulsory labor was the only means of securing the, quote, uninterrupted labor to avoid grave losses of raw material. For example, canes must be milled within 48 hours of harvesting lest they begin to rot. During sowing and harvest seasons, their work schedules were, quote, extended to include Sundays and festival days, end quote, which were otherwise times during which they could engage in subsistence farming or were allowed briefly to rest. In the early 1800s, several factors led to the Puerto Rican sugar industry taking flight and along with it a significant increase in the enslaved population. The sugar economy in Puerto Rico increased from a negligible portion of its agriculture at the turn of the 19th century to its largest crop, at 53,350 acres in 1862. In addition to the policies encouraging capitalist investment and trade in export industries created by Spain's 1815 Cédula de Gracias, Puerto Rico's sugar economy saw exponential growth due to the vacuum created in the Caribbean sugar market after the Haitian Revolution. The United States' increasing consumption of the sweetener and the decline in neighboring Caribbean islands of both enslaved labor and the plantation system through emancipation. Despite Spain's treaties with Britain in 1817 and 1835 to abolish the slave trade on Spanish soil, traffickers increased the shipment of enslaved Africans from the continent and other islands in the Caribbean to Puerto Rico through to at least the end of the 1850s. Puerto Rico's sugar boom between 1815 and 1845 saw an increase in the crop's export from, quote, 838 tons of sugar in 1812 to 52,622 tons in 1848 to 50, end quote. The increase in sugar cultivation, explains Arturo Morales Carrion, quote, went hand in hand, end quote, with an increase of the slave trade to the colony. In the 6 decades between 1776 and 1834, for example, Puerto Rico's enslaved population grew in number from 5,037 to 41,318 people. The enslaved Africans in Puerto Rico, as elsewhere in the Spanish Americas, were labeled racially as negro, black. Those who, between the 16th and 19th centuries, secured their freedom from slavery through coartación, self-purchase, were granted manumission or were otherwise free through birth to free mothers or emancipation outside of Puerto Rico, were also understood capaciously as black, though labeled libertos and gente de color, people of color, to differentiate them from the enslaved population on the island. By the start of the 19th century, there were, quote, only 3 significant castes in Puerto Rico: white, free-colored, gente de color, and slave, end quote. The latter 2 of these which experienced racial prejudice, a normative feature of the colony's culture. Despite rapid overall population growth in the 19th century, Puerto Rico, from 163,192 in 1802 to 617,327 in 1872, the year before abolition. The racial makeup of the colony remained fairly constant. The enslaved population in the colony hovered between 7% and 11.5% of the total population, while the gente de color made up 35% to 45%, combined to make up roughly half of the colony in any given year. Whereas the enslaved population grew because of increased trafficking alongside the sugar boom, the growth of the free gente de color population can be attributed to the varied pathways to manumission for enslaved people, and the influx of free black migrant laborers from other colonies in the Caribbean that abolished slavery earlier than Puerto Rico. The white population also grew as a result of increased migration of peninsular Spanish and Creole elites from elsewhere in Latin America, fleeing hostilities towards Spanish sympathizers in newly independent countries, as well as those of other nationalities who came for new opportunities in the sugar industry created by land allotments and business-friendly policies of the Cédula de Gracias. In direct contrast to the opportunities and prosperity offered to white people in Puerto Rico through the asientos, Cédula de Gracias, and the legal right to traffic and enslave human beings for capitalist gain, nearly all aspects of everyday life for black people in Puerto Rico were restricted through laws, decrees, policies, and practices. For example, the 1826 Reglamento de Esclavo, slave regulations, strictly outlined behavioral codes for enslaved persons to deter uprisings and manufacture obedience under the auspices of crafting humane treatment of enslaved people in the Spanish colony. It drew on earlier Spanish Caribbean, quote, slave codes, unquote, from the 1780s, which served to protect slave owners' rights over their captives construed as property and boost the capitalist gain through the institution of slavery. Alongside slave owners' obligations to provide religious education, food, and clothing to the people they held in bondage, these regulations outlined the captives' obligations to obey and respect their captors and overseers, as well as the plethora of punishments that they could face for infractions. Affirming the ulterior motives of the 1826 Reglamento, Puerto Rican slave owners were, quote, clever in their violations, unquote. Additionally, the officials assigned to enforce compliance with the Reglamento instead became, quote, defenders of the interests of the slave owners, end quote, who were thus allowed to, quote, violate the regulations with impunity, end quote, in all but the most egregious cases of cruelty. This practice contributed to a legally sanctioned landscape of abuses against the colony's enslaved population under the regulations ostensibly meant to protect their rights. During the 19th century, the governors of Puerto Rico enacted other localized decrees specific to limiting the movements and agency of the enslaved Africans of Puerto Rico. In some instances, these limitations extended broadly to gente de color who might be sympathetic to or aligned with the interests of the enslaved population there. For example, in response to fears that agents from the newly independent Haitian Republic were helping to organize enslaved revolts across the region, the governors of Puerto Rico ordered measures to prevent this kind of rebellion among the colony's enslaved and free black populations. In 1806 and 1807, these measures included expanding surveillance over meeting places among enslaved people in the municipalities, prohibiting any, quote, man of color from Santo Domingo from disembarking, end quote, in Puerto Rico, and the immediate, quote, arrest of any black man from Santo Domingo, end quote. Decades later, in May 1848, Governor Juan Prim crafted and enacted the repressive Bando contra la Raza Negra, Decree against the Black Race, which assigned harsh punishments to any black person in Puerto Rico, enslaved or free, who committed any crime, and extended virtual impunity to whites in conflicts with black people. Among them were the death penalty for any enslaved person and 5 years imprisonment for free black people engaged in any act of aggression against a white person, even if the act was justified, and allowed for slave owners to kill any enslaved person engaged in acts of rebellion. The following year, the 1848 Bando was, quote, derogated, unquote, and replaced by the Reglamento de Jornaleros, regulation for day laborers. The Reglamento enforced a strict labor and behavioral regimen on the free working classes, and its accompanying libreta, conduct notebook, system was meant to, quote, discipline all laborers, slaves, and the multiracial free peasantry, end quote. Free gente de color were, quote, significantly more likely, end quote, to be affected by this law than their white counterparts. These harsh decrees and policies were precipitated by a combination of examples of local uprisings and labor non-compliance among the colony's enslaved and free black populations, outlined later in this article, and news of black rebellion elsewhere in the Caribbean, be it the Haitian Revolution or, for the 1848 Bando, the uprisings in Guadalupe, Martinique, and St. Croix at the moment of abolition. Resistance from enslaved people occurred in plantation societies throughout the Americas and took on myriad forms. The hemispheric nature of the phenomenon of enslaved resistance underlines the universality of enslaved populations' liberatory thinking and actions. The brutality and perpetual nature of racial hereditary slavery in the Americas birthed a sustained emancipatory imagination in enslaved individuals on nearly every register in which it could exist. The temporary and the permanent, the individual and collective, the geographic transportation away from and local destruction of the institution of bondage. According to Aline Helg, the plethora of incidents of enslaved resistance can be categorized into 4 primary strategies of resisting slavery used across the Americas: flight and marronage, a specific name for escape from slavery; emancipation certified by a legal document of freedom, also referred to as manumission; military service for men in exchange for promised emancipation; and revolt. The most widely known event of enslaved resistance in the hemisphere is the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, through which a broad coalition of enslaved men and women in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue fought for and won the abolition of slavery and the ultimate establishment of the hemisphere's first free black republic. Though it was unique in its scope and outcomes, it was neither the first nor the last rebellion of enslaved folks driven by the desire to topple the institution of slavery under colonial rule. Their strategies and goals may have varied, but enslaved people in the Americas across imperial lines conspired and took up arms towards an end to slavery under the European yoke. In places such as Spanish Santo Domingo in 1521, Danish St. John in 1733, British Jamaica in 1760, the United States in 1831, and Portuguese Brazil in 1835. Information networks among both the slave-owning classes and the enslaved people themselves allowed for word to be passed from place to place about slavery, freedom, and revolts. For example, a pair of uprisings in 1795 in Curaçao and Puerto Rico are believed to have been inspired by news of the Haitian Revolution. The passage of information was not, however, the only way that enslaved communities in any location developed their own plans for uprisings. The institution was sufficiently cruel everywhere it existed to merit the myriad forms of resistance it inspired in those subjected to lives in bondage. Resistance to slavery in Puerto Rico. Captive Africans and their enslaved descendants in Puerto Rico, like their counterparts throughout the Americas, engaged in practices of resistance against slavery while the institution was in place there. Although popular contemporary narratives in Puerto Rico have long asserted that the enslaved population was docile, aligning with the Tannenbaum thesis and the historiography follows suit in, quote, silencing the agency of enslaved people to resist, end quote, their condition. Enslaved people in Puerto Rico directly challenged the institution of slavery in several documented ways. In Puerto Rico, these generally included 4 categories of resistance: cimarronaje, marronage, rebellions and conspiracies, the lodging of legal grievances under the 1826 Reglamento de Esclavo and other laws, and attacks on the physical and human infrastructure of the plantation system. These strategies of resistance each offered enslaved people avenues to expand their agency under or beyond the institution of slavery. The strategies could provide access to freedom of movement or to enact a re-envisioned societal structure, while others sought immediate respite from particularly cruel overseers or captors, or used official channels to secure lasting changes in their status under the law. As early as 1514, for example, the fledgling colony's governor reported to the Spanish monarchy about enslaved people, quote, who were rising up on the island, end quote, had caused damage to the colonial settlement and were consequently punished. Others in the coming decades noted that enslaved Africans were escaping from their captors and some were rebelling together with the local indigenous Tainos, as occurred elsewhere in the Caribbean at the time. The enslaved population in Puerto Rico continued to resist throughout the 19th century, toward the end of which slavery was abolished there. The rise of the sugar industry in Puerto Rico between 1795 and 1873, and the accompanying growth of slavery there during that time, was a period, quote, categorized by increased resistance acts of enslaved men and women, end quote. Cimarronaje, the act of escape and the maroon life that accompanied it, was one of the earliest forms of resistance in which Africans in bondage and their enslaved descendants engaged. This was prevalent even among the first enslaved Africans brought to Puerto Rico from Spain in the late 1400s and early 1500s. These esclavos ladinos, as they were known, were forced to work mining for precious metals such as gold and silver. In the early 1500s, so many of the enslaved Africans who arrived in Puerto Rico, both from Spain or the African continent, were escaping from slavery that new rules were enacted to combat the resulting overrepresentation of black people in the colony's population. The 1534 edict, for example, mandated that, quote, 1 Spaniard had to move to Puerto Rico for every 5 black enslaved people who arrived, end quote, in the colony. These population issues persisted through the remainder of the century as one of the contributing factors that led to a broader depopulation of Puerto Rico. Alongside the unsanctioned departures of white Spaniards and the escape of indigenous peoples, the governor Luis de Caraza noted in 1563 that the colony was, quote, out of black, end quote, enslaved people, because they had not received a, quote, shipment of blacks, end quote, in 8 years. The shipments would have allowed for the replacement of those enslaved Africans who, if they were not killed by the harsh labor conditions, would have engaged in acts of cimarronaje that frustrated the colony's Spaniards. And in 1619, the Spanish crown published a decree explicitly mentioning that cimarrones revoltosos, unruly maroons, who were causing constant issues for the colony's settlers. In addition to those enslaved Africans who escaped within Puerto Rico's borders, the colony's sparsely occupied natural environment also, quote, provided refuge for escaped slaves who came to Puerto Rico by sea, end quote, from other colonies. For example, groups of enslaved people from Dutch Saba and St. Croix arrived on Puerto Rico's southern coast by boat in 1656 and 1665 respectively. In the 1760s, British Rear Admiral George Townsend noted that Puerto Rico was a, quote, asylum for runaway slaves from the British Islands and the Deans and the Dutch, end quote, islands. So much so that, quote, many fugitives come here daily, end quote, from the Eastern Caribbean. Imperial actors reported and sought the capture of the maritime fugitives forging patterns of flight across the Caribbean, including to Puerto Rico. In 1745, for example, the Danish government, quote, solicited the return of or the compensation for 300 enslaved people alleged to have darted to Puerto Rico, end quote. These fugitives may have been en route to San Mateo de Cangrejos, the present-day neighborhood of Santurce in San Juan, the most well-known among the maroon communities of Puerto Rico, which dates to the 17th century. It was populated by self-emancipated black people who escaped slavery in nearby Danish, Dutch, and English colonies and were granted free status in Puerto Rico under a series of decrees from the Spanish crown. This aligned with practices of establishing complex communities of formerly enslaved Africans who freed themselves throughout the colonial Americas, from British to Colombia, Jamaica, Cuba, and others. Though largely foreign-born, the Maroons of San Mateo de Cangrejos was a potential source of, quote, support to those who were resisting slavery on the island, end quote. And after Spain and the Danish later agreed to mutual restitution of black fugitives, the population shifted to include more Cimarrones from Puerto Rico. In 1870, for example, an enslaved woman named Elena was reported as having fled from the plantation in Plantiffs on which she was enslaved. It was suspected that she fled with a man named Felix Beltran to San Mateo de Cangrejos. When part of San Mateo de Cangrejos was partitioned off in 1774 to create the municipality of Rio Piedras, some of the local and foreign Cimarrones were among the new municipality's residents. With the increases of the colony's enslaved population during the sugar boom in the late 18th to mid-19th centuries, Rio Piedras was one of the places to which fugitives fled, evidenced by the requests for their capture sent to the town's mayor and the number of ransom claims for their return by residents of the municipality. In the 18th and 19th centuries, colonial officials filed more than 700 reports of individual or groups of fugitives from slavery who fled from their captors, and as the, quote, number of notices of escape and arrest warrants tended to be markedly higher than reports of capture, end quote, a significant percentage of them were successful in their escape. For example, Pedro José from San Juan was reported as a, quote, esclavo prófugo, end quote, escaped slave, and his captor offered compensation to anyone who captured and returned him. Many of the Cimarrones of Puerto Rico used the colony's topography to escape slavery under the cover of the forests in the Central Mountain Range and the Karst Zone, made up of small cone-shaped mountains in the northwestern region of the colony. The presence of individual and groups of fugitives unnamed in the archival documents but active until the 1850s were reported in the forests around the municipalities of Isabela, Aguadilla, San Sebastián, Quebradillas, Moca, Camuy, all in the northwestern karst region, and Patillas in the southwestern sugar plains. These Cimarrones were actively pursued by militia gangs in the 1820s with the blessing of the colonial government. The available documentation shows that, to a lesser extent, Cimarrones escaped by sea to the island of Hispaniola, northwest of Puerto Rico. For example, 40 fugitives fled from Toa Baja on the colony's northern coast to Haiti under the cover of a local festival. Figure 1 shows the municipalities in which significant numbers of Cimarrones were documented in the 19th century. This map includes both organized communities like San Mateo de Cangrejos and the areas in which fugitives were known to have escaped. From the late 1700s through the mid-1800s, the governors of Puerto Rico enacted measures to prevent the escape and reward the capture of Cimarrones, including harsh punishments like excessive whippings for those who fled, a year in shackles for those who helped them, as well as rewards and impunity for, quote, all forms of bloodshed, end quote, utilized by individuals involved in their capture. Examples of governmental proclamations or decrees with measures of this kind appeared in 1770, 1824, 1826, and 1849. Despite these measures, enslaved people in Puerto Rico fled from bondage. This kind of response to enslavement came to be a, quote, confrontation used as a weapon and means to achieve freedom, end quote. These acts of cimarronaje exercised an avenue of freedom-making through unrestricted movement and self-emancipation that was otherwise foreclosed to bondspeople. Many enslaved people were successful in their attempts at fugitivity, such as Nepomuceno and José Ignacio, who fled from bondage in 1859 and reappeared after abolition 14 years later. Ana y Maria, who were among the group of enslaved people mentioned at the start of the article who fled from prison in 1837, and Luis in Santa Isabel, who was successful on his second escape attempt in just as many months at the end of 1871. Others were not so lucky and fell victim to the rewards given to those who turned them in, such as Andrés Avelino, who was turned into the authorities in 1849 for having escaped from San Juan to one of the neighboring municipalities. The second major form of resistance to slavery in Puerto Rico was the pattern of armed revolts led by enslaved people in the colony. From the early decades of slavery in Puerto Rico through the height of the sugar industry, enslaved people coordinated amongst themselves to take up arms, whether the tools of their labor or firearms wrestled from local municipal stores, against the yoke of slavery. For example, Moscoso notes that uprisings from enslaved Wolof, Berber, and Bioho Africans, who were described as, quote, warriors, end quote, led to a 1532 ordinance against the importation of enslaved Wolofs. Sued Badillo and López Cantos refer to other incidents in the 1520s that led to the construction of a, quote, fortress in San Germán against the threat of black Cimarrones, end quote, who had attacked the settlement in the years prior. In response to attacks against the colony's settlements from the aforementioned Cimarrones revoltosos, the Spanish Crown's 1619 edict outlined harsh punishments for fugitive Africans who were caught, which were meant to serve as deterrents for other enslaved uprisings in the Spanish Caribbean. And aligned with the increase in the sugar industry and demographic increase of enslaved people in Puerto Rico, there was an increase in the instances of local rebellions led by the colony's enslaved Africans. In 1795, for example, a rebellion of enslaved people was reported in the northeastern municipality of Aguadilla that coincided with the arrival of reports of emancipation at the hands of enslaved people in Saint Domingue. In the few spaces that were shielded from slave owners' direct surveillance, such as within the barracks under the cover of night, groups of enslaved people in Puerto Rico developed conspiracies and launched rebellions. According to reports from colonial authorities, judges, and interrogations of captured rebels, enslaved Africans sought to conquer the municipality in which their uprisings were staged first, drawing on the municipal stores of firearms and subverting the local center of control to their advantage. This, of course, included the killing of white people, planters, and representatives of the state alike, the destruction of the political and agricultural infrastructure of the towns. One such conspiracy to revolt, developed by an African-born Marcus Ciorro in Bayamón in 1821, was thoroughly developed though ultimately betrayed by one of the would-be rebels. It included plans to overtake the local seat of government, name Ciorro the king, and secure the town by cutting off access from all directions and beheading the white people trapped in the town. Due in part to the harsh punishments for involvement in uprisings and the potential avenue to emancipation for revealing plans for a revolt, conspiracies for revolt were betrayed throughout this period by individuals who overheard the plans or were recruited as trusted participants. 3 rebellions in the mid-19th century, in Toa Baja in 1843, Vega Baja in 1848, and Peñuelas in 1850, evinced that, though many were revealed as conspiracies to revolt, others were brought to fruition. Under the cover of a gathering, several African-born enslaved people in Toa Baja of the Longoba ethnic group devised and launched an uprising that led to the capture of the Casa del Rey, a central administrative and governmental building in the town. They sought to capture the bell tower, potentially to sound the alarm about the revolt to other enslaved people in the town, but were held off by local officials for long enough for military forces to arrive and drive the rebels to the sugarcane fields nearby. The soldiers set fire to the cane fields in which they were hiding, sent out dogs to flush them out, and cut down the cane using machetes, eventually leading to their capture. The 8 who were captured, mentioned in the Ministry of War's report included at the start of the article, were executed in front of the town's enslaved population. 5 years later, another group of enslaved Africans across the haciendas of Vega Baja developed a plan to raid the military garrison for its firearms, massacre the whites in the town, and, if they failed, to escape the Hispaniola using boats on the town's Atlantic-bound Rio Quibuco. Under the cover of night, African-born rebel Florencio sounded the alarm, launching the call to arms at the plantations across the municipality. The revolt was quickly brought to an end by the local military forces because one of the would-be participants revealed the plan to a planter. In 1850, on the Hacienda Santa Rita in Peñuelas, a group of enslaved people took the death of their captor, a priest who died without a will, as an opportunity to stop laboring and refuse the authority of any person who tried to force them to work. Though their resulting strike was brief, the local authorities sentenced the leaders, Damaso and Bartolo, each to 25 lashes of the whip. It, quote, signified the construction of a space of freedom that their condition under slavery ordinarily negated, end quote. The rebels involved in Toa Baja and Vega Baja included African-born enslaved people, bozales, who, like the Wolof captives in earlier centuries, may have brought with them knowledge of warfare from Africa that influenced their approaches. This was a feature of Tacky's revolt in British Jamaica and the Amina Rebellion in Danish St. John the previous century, and could have been similarly influential in the attempts by those in the examples in Puerto Rico. Not all who rebelled or planned to do so were African-born, however, as many natives to Puerto Rico were engaged in acts of resistance, such as the leaders of the Peñuelas strike in 1850, as well as others involved in the rebellions in Toa Baja, Vega Baja, and other conspiracies to revolt in Puerto Rico. Regardless of their places of origin, the significant uprisings and conspiracies, from Bayamon to Toa Baja and others during the period, including rebellions in nearby Caribbean islands, such as the aforementioned 1848 rebellion in Martinique that accelerated the end of slavery there, shaped the atmosphere of white fear over black violence in Puerto Rico. These incidents were among the factors that informed and were informed by the oppressive decrees of 1826, 1848, and 1849, mentioned earlier, to limit black agency on the island. Reports of uprisings and conspiracies sprung up in all regions of the colony, undoubtedly shaped by the planter class and colonial administrators' anxieties about violence from the colony's enslaved population. These reported incidents do not include the countless other plans, thwarted or abandoned, that undoubtedly occurred. In several municipalities, there existed recurring patterns of enslaved persons' insurgency, such as Ponce, 5 incidents between 1826 and 1842, Vega Baja, 3 between 1831 and 1848, and Toa Baja, 2 in 1843 and 1846. In other places, Naguabo, Guayama, Humacao, and San Juan, single uprisings were documented, though it is unclear the extent to which conspiracies in any of these places were developed that never came to fruition. More broadly, there was a significant concentration of these incidents, again just among those that were reported, in the municipalities along the southern coastal sugar plains. Where and how would the plans for these rebellions be developed, since privacy and organizing spaces were luxuries not generally extended to enslaved people? Bomba, the Afro-Puerto Rican music and dance form born of enslaved African communities in the colony as early as the 18th century, created space for gatherings in which enslaved Africans engaged in practices of, quote, communication, liberation, and interconnection, end quote. Bomba spaces also served as, quote, an organizational tool for the development and initiation of slave rebellions, particularly on the island's southern regions, end quote. One such gathering in Ponce in 1826 was, quote, just a disguise to cover the subversive goals, end quote, of the enslaved rebels. In the wake of the measures to limit their agency, enslaved people in the colony also resisted the institution of slavery by using legal channels to pursue their freedoms through the local courts. For example, the aforementioned 1826 Reglamento de Esclavo clarified the process of self-purchase and codified the obligations of captors that enslaved people used to garner their individual freedom, in whole or part, from slavery. In Puerto Rico, there were several legal mechanisms to do so, including coartación, self-purchase, lodging petitions or grievances about their treatment as plaintiffs before local magistrates, and claims to freedom promised by captors for good behavior. Through the coartación process, enslaved people could enter contractual engagements with their captors to pay an appraised and agreed-upon sum for their freedom. The process of sale through self-purchase or to another person could also, per the reglamento, be triggered in, quote, cases of abuse, end quote, and, quote, just causes of frustration, end quote. As the purchase price was individual and non-transferable, enslaved parents would need to go through this process and pay a separate sum for their children's freedom as well, to allow for families to stay together. The, quote, existence of this avenue of self-purchase, however, did not imply that it was available to all enslaved people, end quote, because their owners had to, quote, be open to entering into this type of contractual relationship with their slave, end quote. During this period, enslaved people in Puerto Rico, just as throughout the Spanish Circum-Caribbean in the 18th and 19th centuries, quote, appeared in the courts as plaintiffs, end quote, who used these legal mechanisms in service of litigating their freedom. They engaged in the practice of lodging complaints to avoid the kinds of sustained abuse that slave owners habitually visited upon their captives, despite the protections that the reglamento ostensibly provided. These grievances could be filed with an official on their town's municipal councils who, among other duties, was supposed to advocate for their interests throughout the grievance process. As members of the slave-owning classes, these advocates doing so to the best of their ability was not always guaranteed. The infractions by slave owners for which complaints were lodged included ignoring their obligations to feed, clothe, or provide medical treatment to the people they held in bondage, as well as the causing of severe bodily harm. Though punishment for enslaved people was primarily carried out by their captors, the reglamento provided a potential avenue of respite in the most severe cases of corporal punishment that involved extreme brutality or caused, quote, excessive bloodshed, end quote. Enslaved people also used the grievance process to avoid certain future abuses that could likely come from being sold as field hands to notorious slave owners. Such were the cases of Benita El Nais of San Juan and José Lorenzo of Toa Alta, domestic laborers who in 1856 successfully prevented their individual sales to plantations where they would have been assigned to the work of cutting and harvesting sugarcane. In addition to grievances offering the aforementioned protections, enslaved people also petitioned for their full emancipation. This could be done based on promises of freedom made by their captors. For example, in 1868, an enslaved man named Trinidad in San Juan successfully petitioned for his manumission on the grounds that his captor had promised his freedom to his parents. In another case, an enslaved woman named Eleutera in Vega Baja successfully made a claim for her freedom, which her captor had promised her in exchange for sustained subjection to his sexual advantage, quote, which resulted in multiple children fathered by her owner, end quote. After the Moret Law of 1870, which granted freedom to all those enslaved Africans over the age of 60, it was cited by their elderly enslaved people in the colony as justification to petition for their freedom. As illustrated in the case of Manuel Figaro in San Germán in 1872, the process to verify their age was often drawn out, disputed by their captors, and involved an investigation that called for baptism records, the testimony of, quote, honorable men, end quote, and extensive physician's exams, a process that, to the detriment of enslaved plaintiffs, ultimately, quote, rested more on faith and honor than on reliable, rational data, end quote. These petitions were not always granted, even when the same justifications were offered, i.e., precedent was not always honored in respect to these claims. This demonstrated the fundamental reality that the fates of enslaved people were arbitrarily decided, even under the laws that could be used to protect them. Carlo Altieri offers another example of a young enslaved woman who made the same case as Trinidad from San Juan, but was denied her emancipation because the promise was, quote, invalidated due to her parents' lack of legal capacity to accept any promise, first for their being slaves and because the petitioner was underage and black, end quote. Judges' arbitrary and inconsistent decisions made the process particularly challenging. As a result, grievances filed for freedom and other complaints about physical abuses and work conditions, quote, rarely resulted in punishment or penalty for the owners, and, quote, in the majority of the cases, the judges ordered the transfer of the slave to another person, end quote. Ultimately, however, the repeated use of these methods by enslaved Puerto Ricans challenged some of the legal foundations of slavery in the colony, such that it was a, quote, determining factor in the gradual emancipation that those workers achieved through their own efforts, end quote, with significant implications for the, quote, achievement of legal abolition granted by the peninsular authorities at the end of the colonial era, end quote. The fourth resistance type that enslaved Puerto Ricans mobilized before abolition was the use of violence against the plantation system and its representatives. This included setting fire to plantation crops such as sugar cane fields and the physical infrastructure of the plantation themselves. Between the mid-1800s and the abolition of slavery in 1873, another type of, quote, collective protest against the institution of slavery emerged. The murder of plantation overseers carried out by a group of slaves, end quote. There was a marked shift in the mid-19th century from collective uprisings that sought to overtake municipal control or otherwise topple the institution of slavery, to the more localized attacks on plantation grounds and overseers. In Naguabo, in 1843, for example, a group of enslaved people, natives to both Africa and Puerto Rico, led by African-born Manuel de Jesus, burned 2 buildings of the plantation La Fortuna and attacked the overseer and his wife. Although de Jesus had paid off his agreed-upon coartación fee because of the hacienda's administrator's negligence in filing the record of his freedom, he was forced to work another 16 months in bondage. 2 more incidents involving groups of black laborers in the same area of Naguabo, who were arrested for their, quote, rampage of violent resistance, end quote, appear in the archives of August 1871 and 1872. Like the group mentioned at the start of this article, another enslaved man named Martín escaped prison after being sentenced for the, quote, death of the overseer D. Juan Amio, end quote, in 1869. The attacks on overseers occurred with increasing frequency in the decade leading up to abolition, during which at least 8 such murders occurred across the colony. In Mayagüe, Maunabo, Naguabo again, Ponce, Guayama, Dorado, Cabo Rojo, and San Juan. These 4 resistance types, cimarronaje, rebellion, legal mechanisms for filing grievances, and the attacks on the plantation system, represent approaches enslaved Africans in Puerto Rico used to bring an end to their individual and collective experiences of bondage. These were forms of abolitionism at the individual and community level that demonstrate their multi-pronged approach and kindred desire, like their peers throughout the hemisphere, to eliminate the institution of racial slavery. The landscape of resistance in Puerto Rico is marked by the adaptive resourcefulness and attentive savvy of the enslaved people. In their use of the colony's topography, their crafting of clandestine spaces to organize, their application of the letter of the law despite being kept, in general, from learning to read or write, and their targeted attacks on both the people who forced them to toil in the fields on a daily basis, and the very fields in which they were forced to work. Carlo Altieri's assessment of the cumulative effect of their use of the legal mechanisms on the ultimate abolition of slavery in the colony is applicable more broadly to their resistance strategies. They actively opposed the institution of slavery in ways that threatened the fabric of the colony as a society intrinsically reliant on the institution of slavery. Conclusion. From the 16th through the 19th centuries, the Spanish colony of Puerto Rico built its riches through the exploitation of enslaved African and Afro-descended peoples who worked the indigenous lands stolen under the Spanish flag. Contrary to the historiographical trends and common beliefs in Puerto Rico, the black residents of the colony held in bondage were not docile passive bystanders to their own captivity. Like their enslaved counterparts throughout the hemisphere, across imperial and sovereign borders, enslaved individuals in Puerto Rico resisted the institution of slavery in myriad forms. They engaged in 4 recurring avenues of resistance: cimarronaje, rebellion, legal proceedings for emancipation, and the attacks on the plantation system. Their actions and fears of their developing plans for uprisings led the colonial state to develop levers of control over enslaved and free black communities in Puerto Rico. From the abolition of the slave trade in the Spanish Empire in 1817 to the final abolition of slavery in the colony in 1873, the process was gradual and occurred later than the phenomenon everywhere in the hemisphere, except Cuba and Brazil. Abolitionists used both separatist insurrection and legislative pressure to push metropolitan Spain toward ending the institution in Puerto Rico. The actions of the abolitionists, however, should not be understood in isolation from those of the enslaved people in the colony, who persistently attacked the institution and its representatives. Those enslaved people born on Africa and Puerto Rican soil challenged the status quo in the slave/plantation colony for centuries prior to organized abolitionist movements there. The combination of these bottom-up and top-down strategies ultimately led to the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico in March 1873. Just as abolition elsewhere in the hemisphere, however, the Puerto Rican abolition law did not bring an end to the colony's anti-black racial dynamics, the former slave-owning class's desire for labor control over their former captives, nor the material conditions of slavery. In fact, newly emancipated libertos, freed people, were required to work under contract for 3 more years and were denied full political rights for 5 years. After abolition, libertos responded to the, quote, afterlives of slavery, end quote, that these continued conditions created by mobilizing some of the same resistance strategies outlined in this article, as well as new strategies designed in response to the letter and spirit of the abolition law and contract mandate.
Ya llegó